In this presentation, I'll be taking a look at the bridge for Media Studies A Level Component 2, focusing on Season 3, Episode 1, and with a particular focus on representations, because for 2022 we now know that this question will be focused on representations. We will consider things like context, because that's important too, and I'll take a look at relevant theorists as well. It's obviously hard to predict what question you might get in the exam. You might get a generic question about representations, but it might be much more specific. And so when you're revising, representations you might want to consider, and representations I'm going to consider in this video are gender, sexuality, villains, the police, or place, particularly focusing on Sweden and Denmark. I'm going to focus primarily on gender, but pick up on some of the others as we go through. Whenever you are writing about and analysing representations, it is absolutely crucial that you are also discussing relevant contexts, because you must be able to comment on how typical or atypical those representations are of the context in which they are produced and received. So you might consider how the representations are typical or atypical of the society in which the show is produced and broadcast, Sweden. You might even consider the UK when it was broadcast on BBC Three, and also how the representations are typical or atypical of the genre, and you'll consider crime drama and Nordic noir, and we'll have a look at that in a second. So thinking about Nordic noir, as you will know, this is a hybrid genre of crime drama and film noir. It satisfies most of the generic conventions of crime drama, but there are a few distinctions and a few conventions which apply particularly to Nordic noir. The crimes are particularly brutal. A unique convention is strong female leads. This is something which proliferates Nordic noir, and it doesn't always in crime drama as a whole. There are dark urban settings, very typical of the landscape and seasonal nature of Scandinavia. There is a feeling of paranoia in Nordic noir, particularly in the bridge, and we'll consider why in a moment when we think about relevant context. A tortured protagonist is fairly typical of crime drama anyway, as is multi-stranded narratives. But let's think about Steve Neill then, who talks about the notion of repetition and difference within genre. Repetition is necessary to satisfy audience need and demand, but difference is equally crucial because genres must reflect the changing contexts of the audience so that they are satisfying audience needs and demands. So let's think about where Nordic noir came from. Well, we have a disruption of an idyllic Scandinavian society with events such as the assassination of Swedish Prime Minister in 1986 and Anders Breivik's terrorist attack where he killed 77 people in 2011. Those dark urban settings, the brutal crimes, the feeling of paranoia, all seem to stem from this disruption of a perfect society. But we also have the liberal nature of Scandinavian society, widely considered to be the most liberal in all of Europe, particularly Sweden. And that is perhaps where we get the strong female leads from. This is industry side. You're not going to be asked about industries in 2022, but I think it is still relevant when you're considering representations and where they come from. This is, of course, a co-production, co-funded model between SVT from Sweden and DR1 from Denmark, the two public service broadcasters from those two countries. They are both widely regarded as having a left-wing liberal political ideology, which we very much see reflected in the representations within this episode. We have a balance of Swedish and Danish representations of both place and people within this episode, which is important when you consider that those are the two audiences that these producers will be targeting. And the episode seems to reinforce stereotypes of liberal Swedes and more conservative Danes through the characters of Saga and Hannah. When you're analysing your representations, of course, it's important to be focusing on your film language techniques, thinking about how camera, sound, lighting, costume, setting, and the cuts and transitions are used to construct those representations. I'm going to start now looking through the set episode, and we'll start with the establishing shot and the recurring motif of the bridge. This might not be that crucial in terms of representations, but it is a symbol which I think has relevance and importance when thinking about representation, because in this episode we certainly see representations which are transitioning from one state to another, particularly in terms of gender and sexuality, and bridges are often symbols of transition. We see the characters going on a journey in terms of the representations that they are presenting, and that is also a symbolic quality of the bridge. And we're also seeing representations which are aiming to form connections, particularly cross-country connections, and the bridge has relevance there too. So let's have a think about these opening shots. They're quite strange shots, but we get these opening shots of female dolls, and they're discarded female dolls. And I think this is important in terms of representations of gender, because if this is an episode which is looking to break down expectations of gender and stereotypes of gender, then these discarded dolls are particularly symbolic of that discarding of outdated stereotypes as the show looks to move us on in terms of gender representation. And then I thought, this is something I noticed across the whole episode, this interesting framing technique where we get characters and scenes framed in a particular way, either by the fence posts here, as we see with Saga and in the opening shot. We get the crime scene framed by the wall, so we get this kind of tunnel vision. And we get Hannah framed by the pillars here, and Henrik at the end framed by the same pillars. And it seems to me that this is perhaps a symbol of containment. We've got a society which is looking to contain people within a certain label. And as a society, we're obsessed with labeling people and restricting people within a particular identity. And this is a show which is looking to enable people through representation to break free of restricting labels and identities. We'll start here with the crime then, and the crime is really interesting in terms of its representative quality. We have the crime scene set up as a traditional family, husband, wife, and two children, one male, one female. So we have the construction at the start of this stereotypical nuclear family. And this is interesting in terms of gender, because we've got a crime which is seeking to cement typical, perhaps outdated expectations of the family structure. But it's interesting the way that we're positioned. I mean, we could see the spotlight as they're shining a light on what they see, the criminal this is, what the criminal sees as the example that should be set in terms of family representations. We have the girl playing with stereotypically feminine toys. The boy plays with stereotypically masculine toys. This is a crime which is looking to cement existing and slightly outdated expectations of gender. But it is a crime after all. So as an audience, we are positioned to see this stereotypical representation as criminal, as immoral, and as such, we are encouraged to react against such conservative views in an episode which looks to move us as a reader towards an understanding of much more liberal representations of gendered identity. Then we get introduced to our protagonist, Saga, who in the opening few shots is clearly represented as an outsider. And it's appropriate for Saga to be represented as an outsider because she doesn't fit the norms of gender. She is a masculine presenting female in her, particularly in terms of her attitude and her social interactions. And here we see her in a slightly isolated position. People of difference are often othered by society. They are often forced to be outsiders, and Saga is very much of that ilk here. We see her, first of all, framed again by the walls. She's trying to be contained by society in some way. She's isolated in all of these shots. Interestingly, we see her in this lift going up, which almost looks like a cage, as if society's trying to trap her in a certain identity and a certain role. And then we see this shot of her looking at the CCTV camera as if she's being judged by society for her difference. But throughout the episode, we are always encouraged to sympathise and empathise with Saga. And so we're therefore encouraged to adopt this representation of a new gender identity. I'm now going to look at a series of extracts from the episode which I think are quite interesting. This is a 2-minute extract from 11 minutes 20, and it's where Hannah and Saga go to see Natalie Anker, who is the victim's wife. And first of all, we get Hannah discussing Hella Anker's views on LGBT issues and gender identity and gender neutrality. And Hannah talks about these views in quite derogatory terms. She's quite dismissive of them. And so we're seeing not only a representation of gender issues here, but we're also seeing a representation of Danish conservatism. And it's up to Saga really to give us the Swedish perspective. But throughout this little scene, we are encouraged, we are positioned in a way that we are critical of Hannah's derision and we sympathise with the liberal view instead. So once again, the episode, through its representations, is moving us towards accepting an ideology of liberality in terms of gender identity and sexuality. Saga again is represented as something other. She doesn't fit gendered norms. She goes to show Natalie Anker the crime scene on her phone, and it's up to Hannah to stop Saga because Hannah recognises that that would be deeply insensitive. So we see Saga once again not fitting the expectations of femininity in terms of sensitivity, in terms of compassion. And we get again Hannah's prejudicial views here, a man and 2 children like a family, which Natalie reacts against, and we're encouraged to react against that attitude as well. But at the end of the scene, we see Natalie returned to feminine maternal expectation because her son calls and she has to go and fulfill her role as mother. But interestingly, it's not within the nuclear family that we had at the start. This was a same-sex relationship. So it confirms to us that these identities, stereotypical identities of femininity, particularly in the maternal role, can exist in a relationship which isn't a traditional family, which isn't a traditional male-female marriage. An intriguing little scene when they return to the police station, particularly in terms of gender identity. First of all, Saga comes in and just gets undressed. She just gets undressed in the middle of the office, and we look at the other characters who are judging her. Saga doesn't understand social niceties. She doesn't understand those typical interactions. She's neuroatypical. Again, she's probably got autism, so she's giving us a representation which goes against norms in terms of those issues. And Van Zunen is an interesting theorist to apply here, because Van Zunen would say that the display of male and female bodies is different. Well, yes, we get Saga stripping off here, but she's not sexualized in any way. She's very, very comfortable in that position within the office. She doesn't feel any judgment. So she's not sexualized for the male viewer at all. So this section kind of rejects Van Zoonen's claims as it moves us towards an acceptance of a new gender identity. And then we get a discussion of the use of pronouns, and Saga and John are talking about the pronoun hen, which is a gender neutral pronoun, and Hannah says what's wrong with he and she. So we're once again getting that conflict between the conservative representation of Danes and the liberal representation of Swedes. And again, we are positioned to favour that liberal representation. We're given both, but we are positioned to favour Saga's liberal representation. So we're moved towards, again, an acceptance of gender neutrality and gender neutral identities. And then this is probably my favourite scene in the episode. It's the one where we get cutaways from Saga in the workplace to Hans, her boss, at home having dinner with his wife Lillian. And just in that construction, in the way the scene is constructed, we're already breaking down gendered expectation, because we've got the woman in the workplace and the man in the home. And that's also constructed through the lighting. We've got the cold lighting of the workplace associated with the woman here, and we've got the warm candlelit ambience of the home associated with the male boss. So we're breaking down those expectations too. We also see Lillian subverting gender expectations. She is very much the dominant partner in the relationship between Lillian and Hans. But she also, and Hans is seen as much more compassionate in his views towards Saga. He says that he worries about her. But we also see a representation of Saga through Lillian's eyes. Lillian says she's not very approachable. It's hard to say whether I like her or not. Here we see a slightly prejudicial view to those who are not neurotypical. Saga is probably autistic, as I've said, so she doesn't understand those social interactions that make us all feel comfortable. And she's demonized to a degree because of that. So we're encouraged to sympathize with Saga through that representation, and therefore to sympathize with neuroatypical identities too. And once again, at the end of the episode, we see that through Saga herself, at the end of this extract, where she asks Natalie Anker if anyone had ever called Hannah heartless. And Natalie is obviously deeply upset by this, but Saga completely doesn't understand why she's caused such hurt. And we see through Saga's troubled reaction at the end, we're encouraged to sympathize with Saga again. So in this scene, we're very much encouraged to sympathize. We're positioned to be sympathetic towards gender different identities, neuroatypical identities as well. And now to the explosion, and the explosion seems to act as a disruption in terms of gender identity. So we've got the two strong female protagonists with that message of female empowerment here, breaking down gender expectation. The explosion tears that partnership apart. So the explosion acts as a disruption to that liberal view of gender identity. And following the explosion, we see gender expectation restored, because Hans comes in as the male boss and he very much takes control. He orders Saga to go home, and she is forced to follow that order. So we see outdated gender hierarchies of male superiority in a patriarchal society restored at this moment in the episode. And it's not an accident, therefore, that the very next shot after this scene is of the bridge, because this is the moment where the episode seems to be transitioning from a representation of female empowerment to a representation of male dominance within a patriarchal society. And that is picked up again towards the end of the episode, because we see Saga, when she goes home, is returned to that position of feminine hysteria, which is an outdated representation. And following that, we see Henrik assigned as a male detective to replace Hannah. So the blend of male and female, the equality of male and female, is restored at the end here. We've touched on the representation of the police, but let's consider each of the characters. First of all, you can see that in terms of the main police identities, we have 3 women, 3 strong women and 2 men. So we're breaking down expectations of the genre. Typically, the conventions of the genre had men in positions of power, women in subservient or administrative roles. Well, Nordic noir as a genre and modern crime dramas as a whole are looking to break down that expectation. But once again, with Hannah's demise at the end of this episode, we can see the balance is restored. We also have a complete blend here. Normally in the 2 protagonists we would have one rule breaker, a maverick, and one who sticks to the rules. We don't have that here. They're both thorough in their work, Hannah and Saga. Instead, what we have is a blend of ideologies. We have Saga's liberal Swedish ideology and Hannah's conservative Danish ideology. And then we have also, within Hans and Lillian's relationship, we have a subversion of gender expectation. Lillian is superior in many ways to Hans, and she's certainly superior within their relationship. And then criminals. Well, they're not all criminals, these people here, obviously, but we get an intriguing section in the middle of this episode where we are introduced to a number of characters who are potential criminals. We get Morton, the typical outsider, the war veteran, probably got PTSD, lives on his own, a very typical representation of a potential criminal. Then we get Henrik. Henrik, actually a police officer, but he's often presented initially with low-key lighting in mysterious settings. There's something mysterious about him. We then get the cleaner, and he is very, very typical of a potential criminal. Lives on his own in a dark, lowly lit flat, keeps slightly exotic pets such as snakes and tarantulas. He's a very typical potential villain. And then we get Lise Anderson, who again is not a criminal but a mother, but she has extremely right-wing views, and she actually rejoices in the death of Hella Anker, because she hopes that with the death of Hella we see a death of Hella's liberal views on gender identity and gender neutrality. But none of these are criminals. So I suppose what this goes to show is that Nordic noir paranoia, that criminality could be lurking anywhere within society. You don't know where criminality is. It doesn't come in stereotypical forms. And that's confirmed by the fact that it is, in fact, the guide from the museum who is the criminal. He's educated, he's polite, and so we learn this in future episodes. So it's this idea that you never know, this notion in Nordic noir that you're always unsure, you're always paranoid, you're always looking over your shoulder. Criminality can exist anywhere. Let's finish by considering some of our set theorists and how we might view this episode through their lens. Well, the episode certainly seems to support David Gauntlet's claim that the modern media gives us a more diverse range of identities from which we might construct our own identity. If you do not subscribe to gender norms, you get a number of identities here which will legitimize and reinforce your own. If you are not straight in terms of your sexuality, you get a number of representations which will enable you to reinforce your own identity. And even if you're neurodiverse, through the character of Saga and her being the powerful protagonist, you get a representation which is quite empowering in terms of neurodiversity. Judith Butler talks about performativity in terms of constructing gender, and we see through Hannah and Saga two characters who present as stereotypically masculine, even though they are entirely feminine. And so we're seeing a performative construction of a new kind of gender identity, particularly through Saga, but also through Hannah. So Saga is performatively reconstructing ideas about female identity. And although Todorov isn't a representation theorist, and this is a representation question, I think he's actually valid and interesting. Because if we consider how the representations are structured, we start with an equilibrium of female empowerment. The women are in control at the start of this episode. We've got Saga and Hannah as the protagonists. We've got Lillian as the Danish police boss. The disruption might therefore be seen as the explosion, where that moment, that partnership of female empowerment is disrupted and destroyed. And the new equilibrium is when Henrik is assigned to the case to replace Hannah. So in terms of ideological significance, Todorov talks about how the way in which the equilibrium, the narrative is resolved, has ideological significance. We might say that the ideological significance is that society is not ready, perhaps patriarchal society is not ready for quite such a representation of female empowerment. And this is very typical of patriarchal societies. Whenever we see strong women, we look to break them down because they're a threat to patriarchal order. And so perhaps that is Todorov's message at the end of this. That would be Todorov's reading of this at the end of this episode.